I will talk about hip and groin problems and how do we manage. I will also refer a little bit to optimal loading and build a little bit upon what was started this morning. And we will talk about different approaches. And if you are about to fall asleep or you think it's been a long day, I will bore you with evidence-based practice here in the end. But before, we will talk a little bit about training load. And the whole idea that also Tim was talking about this morning is that we would like that the capacity to handle load is actually, we have an ability to do that more than the actual training load put upon us. So we want it to be balanced like this, so that the training load is not inducing all types of overuse and injuries that we don't want in our sport. So if you remember or take 3 things from this talk, these are the 3 things I want you to remember. We want to increase the resilience of our athletes. We have some evidence now for that. We used to have none in this area, but now we have some evidence. We want to identify issues as early as possible. This is more a proposal for me, because the evidence here is not so big yet. And then, as Per Hölmig also showed you, that you actually can intervene accordingly in patients with hip and groin pain. And we will touch a little bit upon that and see if we can put that into a framework. So, if you look at the evidence, we published in Copenhagen a study on the FIFA 11 Plus and also the FIFA 11. And basically what we could show in football was that when you use the FIFA 11 Plus, not the FIFA 11, but the FIFA 11 Plus, which is a more aggressive strength and conditioning program, has more conditioning perspective and approach, and you use these levels, progressive overload that Tim was also alluding to this morning, then you can actually get very good results overall by reducing injuries by around 40%, but also it looks as if you could do something in the hip and groin area where you can have a 41% risk reduction as well on hip and groin injuries. So this is very positive, because this was one of the first time we saw that we might be able to, with a general program, to actually address hip and groin injuries, at least in football. My talk will be team sports. You will see that most of my reference is football, and that's just because most of the research we do and most of the research out there is actually done in football. This is the best club in the world, 30 years ago. And he was a very good player as well. What I'm going to talk about is a study from Norway that we did together with Joa Harøy. And we actually looked at the FIFA 11 Plus program, because in the FIFA 11 Plus program, there are no exercises that are actually related to the adductors. And we just learned from Per Hölmig that you cannot live without your adductors. And but before getting to a larger study, we actually examined this approach. So in 2014, Andreas Serne actually developed this approach called the Copenhagen Adductor exercise. And then in 16, Lasse Ishøj, also from our group, looked at, so Andreas was looking at the EMG activity, and it looked like a high load exercise. But then we also know that EMG actually can be a difficult measure to apply. It's quite variable, and you don't get very precise results on what you want. So Lasse took it to the next level and looked at this in a randomized controlled trial over an 8-week period, looking at whether you can actually make athletes or football players stronger in the adductors when you apply this program. And Lasse, having a background now also in sports science, did a very aggressive program. And as you can see, they increased the hip adduction eccentric strength by 36%. And that is a lot. But you also, if you look in that article, you will also see that they did a lot of exercise in that article. But Lasse made his point. It works if you do a lot. And it also works to a large extent, because we know, and we'll hear about this later, that this is a risk factor that you would like to modify as well. He even saw that you had eccentric hip abduction as well, and you will see that you have to work around the core and the pelvic in other muscles than just the adductors to do this exercise. If you don't believe me, you can do this in the break, and then you will see. So, yeah, Joa did this study where he wanted to now to put this exercise into the FIFA 11 Plus because this approach was missing. So what he did was he had one group he called the Copenhagen Adduction group. So he took out the Nordics, which is a normal part of the FIFA 11 Plus. But other than that, the rest was the normal FIFA 11 Plus program. And then the Nordic hamstring group, that's actually the normal FIFA 11 Plus program. So here he takes out Nordics and puts Copenhagen's in instead. And here he's just looking at the normal program without any emphasis on the adductors. 8-week intervention period. The old FIFA 11 Plus, the modified one with no Nordic, but with Copenhagen adduction. 3 weekly sessions. If you have any questions, just bother Joa or invite him next time. He's from Norway. He will answer any questions to this study. Again, the approach was like in the FIFA 11, 3 levels. I will show you the levels afterwards, but 3 levels, and the idea is that you go as fast as you can to the advanced level. And this was how it looked like. You had, he was measuring eccentric hip adduction strength, but also knee flexion strength in the noteboard, and they were looking at sprint as well. I will mainly focus on the eccentric hip adduction strength because in your study, because we knew from lesser study that it was way too aggressive, and if we have players and you want to perform this on players, some would be sore already. We couldn't apply this very aggressive program, so we had to find something less aggressive and still hope for an effect. So what we were looking at here was whether we would maintain an eccentric hip adduction strength effect, but reducing the volume of the exercise. And we were able to do that, and Joa showed that there would still be a difference. There was a within-group difference where you saw no difference in the normal FIFA 11 Plus, where they did the Nordic hamstring, so no difference in the eccentric hip adduction strength. And it's a little bit too fast, but there's also a between-group difference, around 8 to 9%. So it seems that we could still hold on to this very important eccentric strength in the hip that we want to have for our athletes, because we know it's been shown to also be a risk factor. And then Joa, being a very, I would say, eager student and coming from a place where they have almost as much money as here in Switzerland, they were able to do a large randomized controlled trial and try to test this exercise out. And now Joa, instead of doing the FIFA 11 Plus, he actually went, you can say he went all in and just took the Copenhagen Adductor protocol out of that FIFA 11 Plus and said, because we know that it's very difficult to get people to do prevention in general. So we said, okay, one exercise, if they can't do one exercise, it's just because they don't want to do anything. So this was the idea, try to see, go all out on one exercise, and the exercise was the Copenhagen adduction. There's a nice infographic about the program and about the results, and I will show you that in a moment. This was the size of the study, so a big study, not the biggest study, Per Helmig would say. There is a bigger study, but we're not going to talk about that today. That he randomized into 2 groups, and he followed them through 1 season. And this was the program, so the Copenhagen adduction, and it had 3 progression levels, like in the FIFA 11 approach. And it was supposed. It's the good thing about it is that you can perform it on the pitch, which is very important as well. And it looks like this. You have this level. You might laugh a bit. That looks a little bit lazy, and it is. And the idea was that if you had pain, you could always return to this one. So no player could say, "Oh, this is too aggressive. I don't want to be in the study. I don't want to be in the program." If they had a little bit of pain, they would start here. And they could always do these adduction lifts. Level 2, try to make the lever shorter, and level 3, long lever, but still you scissor up with this leg, and you push again also here from your elbow, but lift up with this adductor, and you have to push from that side as well. So you're actually working both sides, most aggressively on the top side though. And these were the progressive overload, 2 sessions, 1 set per side, so you just turn them around, and then you've done your exercise. 3 to 5 repetitions, so again, very slowly build up, not very aggressive, just like when you introduce the Nordics, which is a very important point. And then you build your way up to 12 to 15 repetitions, and you have 3 sessions, still 1 set per side. So very similar to the Nordic hamstring approach, and very important that you start slowly, otherwise you can get a lot of DOMs with this kind of exercise. And then another important thing is that when you're in season, you have a maintenance session once a week. And he did that throughout the season. Again, and you end up again with 12 to 15 repetitions, and you do that 1 set per side, once a week for the rest of the season. Then what we also did in this study, and what was really clever, is that we used this overuse questionnaire. And what if you heard Håvard's talk this morning, they were looking at the injury burden and also looking at the prevalence of pain instead of just looking at time loss injuries, because time loss injuries doesn't make a lot of sense in most overuse injuries. And the way you define whether you have a groin problem or not, so now we're not talking psoas, adductor, hip, we're talking about groin problems, is that if you have nothing up here on these 4 questions in relation to participation, training volume, performance, and pain, then you would be deemed to having no groin problem. As soon as you move down here in just 4 of these domains, then you will have a groin problem. And if you answer particular in relation to training volume and performance, and if it's something that to a major extent has reduced your training volume or your performance, then it's defined as a substantial groin pain. And this runs with an app, so it's very easy to handle these data. There's no interpretation, it depends on their answer. And the outcome measure was all groin problems, so the main hypothesis was that we would reduce that by 40%. And we were also looking at substantial groin problems. Looking through 28 weeks, that's the Norwegian season. You have to remember this is way up in the north. They can't play as much as we can down here, so their season is a little bit strange compared to the rest of the world. But that's how it is. And then some fancy statistics that I don't want to bore you with. This is important. So what you can see here is that when you then look at this through a whole season, you will get 2,500 reported groin problems on a weekly level on all these players. If you did a study with 1,000 players and you use time loss, if you are lucky, you will get maybe 50 injuries. So this is a completely different way of looking at this, and a completely different way of addressing the issue of having groin pain. And this is one of the first studies. There's one on shoulder injuries as well, or shoulder pain prevalence. And this is our problems, and this is the second one, and both from Norway. Here you can see that 37 have time loss, so it's not that they don't have time loss, but from the older studies, it's been very, very difficult to actually capture these injuries, and we've been missing a lot of injuries. And this is, I think, also where the app system or SMS track is really, really helpful, because we don't lose all of this important information. And when we lose information, it's very difficult in our studies to show something when there's something there. And then you can see a lot of suggestion that a large majority is overuse by this gradual onset. So compliance of doing the program was really high, which it can be sometimes in RCT. It's a bigger problem now, because now we have to implement it. But here you can see that they had good compliance in relation to around 70% of the prescribed sessions. And this is the effect that Joa showed. Here you see, before the preseason, the prevalence, weekly prevalence was 35% in both groups. So quite a lot are reporting having groin problems. Then you have the intervention, and this was another smart thing that Joa did, was do the intervention in the beginning and before you start collecting injuries or prevalence, groin problem prevalence, because the idea is that you want to increase the load and the capacity to handle load, but you need an adaptation period. So Joa was one of the first timers to do this, and he was doing this also based on some of our suggestions, because we made that mistake probably in the past. And here you have the result, and what you can see here is that the control group not doing the exercise has overall more prevalence of groin problems. What you can see also, though, is that during the preseason you will have less. Also in the control group you can see that they do come down, and we've seen that in another study in Spain as well. So when you have a preseason period, you start up quite high, and then just by adaptation to the football usually comes down. But you can still see that if you add a strengthening program for the adductors, you can actually push that down so that what you have down here is actually almost close to nothing. Then on the substantial, so this was all problems, everything from minor to up to substantial, and then on substantial we could show a difference, although it could look as if some parts of the season there could be something there, but we haven't fished. We learned this morning you shouldn't be fishing, so we don't do that, and we registered the study, and there was no fishing. You could fish a little. So the effect of the Adductor program is actually, it comes to a risk reduction of 41% on all groin problems. On substantial, again, you can see the p-value, and also we couldn't show a difference. And you probably need even more participants if there is something to come after. I don't think Joa will do that study. I think he's done with large RCTs. You do that once in your life. Okay. So how do we put this into perspective? This is a footballer, a very good one, and he is now in Denmark. He would be somewhere in the preseason. Oh, sorry, in England he would be around the preseason here in July, and in 2017. And let's say he does this program, then he's better protected for the season. He keeps doing the program. That's what these areas show. He does the program, and then he's maintaining his adductor fitness, or whatever you want to call it. And then hopefully this will have an effect in relation to not getting a groin injury or groin problem during the new season. The problem here, and these are also in your study, is that a lot of football players, and Per showed that this morning, that 50% of them, more or less, will already have a problem for the previous season. So how does this affect going into doing prevention and also into trying to prevent problems in the new season? And this was, if you remember, this is also why we had to be very gentle on some of the players, because to get them into the program, we needed this sort of very cozy exercise on level 1. So here you have, looking backwards, you will see that there can be lots of issues for some players. And what we've looked at here is, how does it actually look when you go from season to season? And this was a study we did and published in the Scandinavian Journal. And here you see, this was the study that Per referred to. 50% will have pain in a season. But then the interesting part is that if you go to the next season, the season break doesn't really help them. 50% of those, 50%, will actually go into the new season. Some will take the same problem into it. Some will develop a new problem. So when you start up the new season, you have lots of problems from the previous season that you have to address. Then you have a group where you don't have so many problems. Few of them will maybe develop problems. And you also have some who's quite protected. And that's the thing with groin problems. There might be a good part of your group that are doing fine, but you have 2, 3, or 4 players that are really causing a lot of prevalence and giving you a hard time as a doctor or a therapist, or even as a coach. Okay, then you carry something into the next season. Does it matter? Well, what we could see is if you had nothing in the previous season, then your Hager score, and you have heard about that, so the Hager score goes from 0 to 100, and it has 6 domains, and it looks on pain, symptoms, ADL, sport recreation, performance, and quality of life. So if you're up here around 100, you're doing fine. If you have 0, you have really high severity of problems related to your hip and groin area. What you can see here is that if you had nothing in the previous season, you look very fine in the new season. No problems at all, very few symptoms, your sport is fine. But the longer you've had problems in the previous season, the worse your scores gets. And we did another study in Spain. This is another PhD student. Has done a tremendous study with 303 Spanish players. He saw the exact same thing when you look at strength. So he did squeeze testing in the position that Per showed you, that we do in Copenhagen, between the ankles, so that we could target the adductor longus, especially because we know that it will carry a lot of problems there. And we saw the exact same thing, that you would have no difference between the groups if you had groin pain or no groin pain, if you just lumped everything together. But as soon as you looked at those who had it for more than 6 weeks, suddenly there was a 20% deficit. So again, having groin pain or no groin pain is not the only measure. Could be quite interesting to understand how big is the deficit that these players are carrying around, because that might mean something in your approach as well. So that is why our suggestion is to identify these issues as early as possible. And one way to do it is to look at how, as soon as they develop something for a week or two, is to actually react, do something. The other thing is to try and get measures on strength also before the preseason. Or you can even do Hagers. But the easiest one is probably just to ask them, very simple questionnaire or interview to hear last year, how did you have groin pain? Yes, no. If, roughly how many weeks? So here is the player who had lots of problems in the past, not the past season, but the season before. And then we'll keep having these breakdowns. Problems from time to time become all right, but then they have breakdowns again, even though they did yours program. How do we actually address that? So Joanne showed you this one earlier today, and this is something I can't say we've developed this. This goes way back in Sweden to Roland Thomé, but we've used it in a different way. So instead of just asking for any activity, we've standardized this way of testing, so a maximum squeeze test, and then you try to measure 0 to 10, how painful is that in the specific region of here. And players can usually tell you, that's a 2, that's a 3, that's a 6, and so forth. And then what we did in this study is we related that again to the Hagers and to the sport score, and our hypothesis was that it would be related to the Hagers sport. Basically, it was related to all subsets, and they are related as well, so that makes sense. But what you could see again, if the players said 0 to 2, they would have close to a perfect Hager score, no problem. If they said 3 to 5, something starts to happen. They start to develop symptoms, or they have their sport they are not performing in their sport, and so forth. And with 6 to 10, they actually start to look like patients. This is how our patients look when they come in with groin pain in our clinic. And this is why we're quite comfortable to say, now you actually have to stop. Red light, stop. Yellow light, pay attention, just like when you're driving. You can choose to cross, but you might get a ticket still, or crash into somebody. And then green, go. And this has been replicated in ice hockey players now, and we get a very similar pattern. I would say the football data are a little bit stronger, but you get a very similar pattern where you have differences from level to level. And this is in high-level ice hockey players in Sweden. And yeah, very similar to, I think, did Sweden beat Switzerland? Oh, we're not talking about that. Sorry about that. So again, identify issues early. And we have certain tools to do that. And this is another PhD student and her main supervisor that I was fortunate enough to work with. Martin works at the ARS, at the academy, with the best players in Australia, and Tanya is from La Trobe. And the idea here is actually screening. Not to screen to predict, but to screen for problems which are already there. And I will show you with Martin's approach why that might be useful. So the idea is here to actually try to detect this and sometimes catch them in this yellow period and do something before it becomes something where Per has to do surgery. We don't want that. Or train them. So Martin's approach was this, and he did 2 studies. The first one he did during congested periods, so this was a tournament. They were playing a lot of games in the same weeks, lots of football in 1 week, with a first game and a final, and they went all the way to the final in Southern America, I think it was. And here you can see the traffic light. So here you can see the players. It looks like there's not that many players, but a lot of them follow similar patterns, so that's why. And here you see first game, and here's the final here, down here. And what we could see during that period was that when you look at the adduction force, because Martin was so smart, he also put in a handheld dynamometer. So he not only got 0 to 10, he also got the force when they were squeezing. And what you can see here, that this is the force during the tournament and in relation to the cumulative RPE. So this is a sort of a surrogate of load during a tournament. So the more load they had, the less was the adduction force. And they actually dropped 20% during a tournament. Again, 20%, you start to look like a patient. So the idea is exactly what Howard Moxness was saying this morning. If you come home from a tournament, it's no good just to pretend that nothing has happened and you just continue training. So you have to do something. I think you should go to the tournament still. Howard is a little bit drastic. I think players like tournaments, but you should do something else when you come back, and you need to recover, probably not just in the adductors, but also in other muscles. And he also did an approach for the full season, and that was even more detailed. And this is something you can apply in the academy, and that was what Martin did with the AIS. The idea is still the traffic light. So whenever they have an alert, which means that they have reduced adduction strength in more than 15%, or the ratio is below 0.9, that's an alert, and then they go into retesting in the afternoon. If they're fine, and no, just business as usual. Hager's the same, below 75, something has to happen. We have to react upon it, and that's what Martin did. And then the idea is, if he then do the clinical examination, if he finds something, so in his screening find that there's actually a problem, painful at the insertion, maybe they start telling you, I am actually a little bit sore, then he does intervention and see if he can fix it quickly. If not, he will consult the coach. They will talk about load management. The idea is not to take them out of football, but to make a different plan for that player and then put them back in as soon as possible. This is not something you can do in a clinic. You have to be with the players at a weekly basis, and Martin was that when he was in AIS. And that's also, I think, this is at academy level, this is an interesting approach. And what he also showed was that during 2 seasons, when his players came in, and Andrea will say more about this, they came with an abductor ratio around a little more than 1. But during that period where he did this approach, he was actually able to bring them up to a much safer level where they looked more as they should and more like normals. So again, just this is an idea. It's not high-level evidence, but it's an idea for where we have to go. And just to show how it looks in the real-world academy, this is Neil Light, also a PhD student. Here you can actually see how much, we call it injury management, we have in English youth football. So these are 64 academies in the Premier Leagues and the levels below. And you see here that if you are at this level, where Rinche told us you have to be careful maybe with these hips, a lot of things going on. You have different lever arms, different moment arms, because they grow a lot. The focus on hip and groin injury management is actually not that big. It's actually quite a little, and then it grows as they become seniors. Maybe it should be the other way around. Just a thought. Thank you very much.